Martha and Danny. And without further ado, let's start with Prime Minister. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Being an ex-felon puts you in a unique situation. It means you're an individual that has been faced with the brutality of a modern police state in the United States. It means that you're an individual that has gone through the prison and justice system and knows what got you there in the first place. These subtle pressures in the community that push you to crime and the much larger ones, you're an individual that is likely best placed to divert people from that path and break down the institutional power of a lot of criminal organizations that exist in society today. We think these individuals provide a large amount of benefit, and barring them from service is something that is done mostly on intuition rather than a logical basis. Quickly, by way of setup, what do we support our opening government? We think there are broadly two kinds of people that are likely to want to pursue this policy at the point they're now able to be police. The first are likely to be opportunists, who we think are going to be aggressively screened out by any kind of policing organisation. And the second is people that take an active stake in the community. That might be something that always existed internal within them, or something that has been demonstrated as a process of rehabilitation. But we think these are individuals where the large majority of the debate takes place. Obviously, this debate isn't about police officers that commit a crime. Those individuals are fired. These are individuals that have committed crimes in the past, oftentimes as young individuals, and they want to come to the police. What do we do then? Firstly, we impose a 3-year stand-down period on all of these people, simply for the basis that we want to see that over a certain period of time, they have not committed any other kind of offence while from in prison. Secondly, we think given police departments bear a lot of the reputational costs of taking these people on board, to the extent they're likely to engage in the practice of hiring, to the extent they've been successful at your relative police training institution, they are likely to apply extra scrutiny on these individuals to avoid embarrassment and the professional repercussions that could come from that. And lastly, we would note that comparatively, these people, the kinds of people that are well-spirited are likely going to go down the path of being police officers, or they're likely to go to other things like community watchdog groups, which make them significantly less effective. 2 points in this speech. Firstly, why these individuals have a meaningful role in decreasing the rate of crime in communities. And then secondly, how this promotes basically a healthier culture of rehabilitation at the point ex-felons are in the police force. First, on decreasing crime. The broad question to ask is, why is the case that these recruits are uniquely good? And we bring you 5 structural reasons. The first is that these are individuals that are likely to uniquely understand the pressures to engage in crime in the first place. These are likely individuals that have been that are socioeconomically impoverished, that are likely people of colour, given all the statistical data from various countries that seem to demonstrate these people compose the majority of incarcerated felons inside particular countries, which means they're likely to have been exposed to things like a dealer on the street pushing you towards selling drugs at the first instance, or the need to commit some kind of crime, either because you want the support of and like social praise of more powerful individuals from criminal backgrounds, or simply because out of necessity. Which means these are the people that are best equipped to identify where similar youths inside the community are engaging in the same kinds of practices and behaviours that would see them making the same mistakes they did in their life. What we would note importantly is that because these people have gone through these experiences, they've necessarily a position where they're probably more empathetic to those experiences, as opposed to a large number of police officers that tend to be detached from their communities that come from a place of judgment. Secondly, we would note these individuals are more likely to be related to by members of the community. Firstly, because it's more likely that they may have active family links in the most at-risk communities. But secondly, even to the extent they are not operating those communities, they're likely to more reasonably and honestly convey the experiences that they themselves have experienced in a way other police officers are not equipped to do so. But thirdly, we would note these people are likely in a position where they're better equipped than most police officers to engage in conflict de-escalation, because they've in fact been involved in the acts of crime itself, and in many cases maybe involved in criminal enterprises. They've either had to prevent actions from escalating between criminal organizations, or importantly, they've seen how instances can be escalated and the necessary steps to take that. And obviously they're coupled with all the training police officers get as well. But fourthly, We would note the important part here is that it signals to individuals in the community that reform is both possible and necessary, because at the point that individuals that come from traditionally marginalised communities are now members of the police force, it signals to the rest of the community there is hope in the police and there is a capacity to buy in, which flows on to a number of benefits in terms of engaging with police to prevent instances of domestic violence where you otherwise would not do so because you do not have any trust in them. But fifth, we would note that in a lot of these cases, these individuals are likely to have specialist knowledge and are properly sought out. These are the kinds of people that have likely been involved in drug crime and know the particular ways that smuggling happens in terms of how it goes through particular ports, the kinds of companies that might be involved in that, all the hallmarks of a company that might be engaging in money laundering. They also might have intricate knowledge in terms of gangs and the way in which they're composed. These are all unique facets of information they uniquely have that they can bring that other police officers cannot do so. Before I move on, opening.
Okay, so, sorry.
Are we opening?
Yeah.
If criminals were allowed to become cops, would you also abolish the background checks that stop them from getting guns in America?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, okay, so to the extent that there are no background checks and there's your default status, then yes, we would not apply background checks in that instance. The US does have background checks, though, in terms of the Brady Bill and stuff like that. I mean, I've made this point before in a debate with Mark. I thought he would have known this. It's literally the case that you are checked on a 7-day waiting period. You are checked by background checks, so we wouldn't remove them because they're the status quo. Secondly, why this promotes a healthier image of ex-felons. And broadly, we would note that there are two groups in society in the way in which they perceive and engage with the criminal justice system. The first is that there are the kinds of people that likely believe the inherent humanity of criminals and recognize them as victims of circumstance they're forced to engage in the actions, and in many ways are angry at the police for exacerbating those circumstances. But secondly, there are those that look down on them, that view them as criminals, that do not like them, that find them morally culpable. We think what this does by putting them in positions of power, and note importantly, given these screening processes in place, this is likely the best and most spirited people, and it's a strong effect in making reform visible in the community. What is the effect of that? There are two. First, we think what this does is it decreases the idea in the public for the second group that these are people that are fundamentally irredeemable, because at the point they're seen to be actively upholding the law as opposed to their previous profession, it means that these are people, the best and most visible symbols of reform, the police officer that you see on your day-to-day and talk to. But secondly, it also shows that reforms through programs and prison systems can actually be effective in reducing the incidence of crime at the point that people are now seen to uphold the law. The consequences is that people are more likely to engage with rehabilitative programs, those that are most effective in combating crime, in terms of not dealing with crime being circumstantial and recognizing that people age out of that. It's rehabilitation programs that deal with that, and it also stops the cruel and unjust process of sending people to quick prison. We're so proud to propose.
I thank Prime Minister for that speech. May I now invite Leader of Opposition. Here.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Epic. All right, starting in 3. Let's start with the issue of characterization. Who actually are these cops? Because side affirmative basically says, well, there are 2 types of cops. You know, there are the opportunists who are going to be screened out. But let's be honest, not a lot of police departments are that good at screening people. For instance, when the majority of police shooters have to get fired from their own particular precincts, a neighboring precinct just hires that exact policeman. I'm pretty sure this same thing happened in the case of George Zimmerman, but it's happened in dozens of other cases of police shooters, which is basically, I think, pretty solid evidence of the fact that these police organizations are either not that good at screening out people who happen to be bad, but I think given it's quite obvious that someone has, you know, shot an innocent person, I think it's far more likely that these police organizations have very bad interests, and so they don't apply the same metrics that side opening government thinks they will apply. Rather, we think they simply do not care about the really bad felonies that these people might do. Because, for instance, it is just an empirical fact that in 40% of households that contain a police officer, there is domestic violence. This is just a statistic that exists, it is true, and they can't really try and refute this, you know, facts don't care about their feelings. So what this means is that sort of shows the way that cops don't care about the crimes, the felonies, that are by far the most important ones that we should be caring about, but also what it shows is is the nature of the cops who are going to be the ones doing the screening. And so we think where they call them opportunists, we think these people are far more likely to be evil people who have done horrible things. So given the nature of current police forces, the question is, who are they going to be letting in now? And so if it is the case that they do have screening mechanisms, it's far more likely that they're going to be used to kick out to not let in the person who has been done for a minor drugs charge, which I should mention is a misdemeanor, not a felony. Topic's not about them. But rather they will be constructing these sorts of tests in order to let in the people that are most like the people who are currently in the force, the people who are most likely domestic abusers, rather than the people who are far more likely to be helpful, that side opening government thinks they are actually going to be. So they're going to let in people who are just like them. Domestic abusers, people who have killed others on the job, those who have abused their powers in the past. And this is evidenced by the shocking record of police precincts all throughout America. That's what we think the characterization of this debate actually is. So let's move on to the bigger issues in this debate. 2 points. The first is simply that policing gets worse. It's worth noting that if someone has committed a felony, I think they've almost certainly been to prison. And it's just worth noting what it is that prison does to people. And what it doesn't do to people, I think, which is far more obvious, is they do not get rehabilitated, simply because of the way the prison industrial complex serves to traumatize people, the way that humiliation is institutionalized through these rituals of things like sexual abuse that manifest themselves in cavity searches, things that are actually crimes against humanity, the deprivation of humanity that is afforded to basic prisoners. And we think if you do go through this, it is far less likely that you're going to come out on the other side someone who is well-adjusted and someone who is able to be trusted with a gun, who can threaten people and who has the power to kill people in certain circumstances. And this is evidenced not just by my rhetoric, but also by the fact that recidivism is enormous. People who go to prison end up going back just because it messes with them so severely. So it is unlikely that if someone has gone to prison and has been convicted for an awful felony, which is the likely case in this side of the topic, it is unlikely that they have reformed enough to be trusted with a gun on the streets of the city. So what happens is, So that's the context of what these people are like. But also we have to be very, very careful with those people who are cops for a number of reasons. That's because these people have an enormous amount of power to misuse. As I said, these are the people who have guns, and they're the ones who are trusted with de-escalating things. But also it's worth noting that in their job, they will have to deal with victims of felonies. And if they have done a felony, it's very likely that those people who they're dealing with are victims of the exact same felony that they committed. And because they have committed that felony, it is very unlikely that they have empathy or the ability to communicate with them meaningfully and actually do much to solve the situation. For instance, if it is a cop who has a domestic violence felony and they are called to deal with a domestic violence case, it is unlikely they are going to be of much use, simply because by virtue of their previous behavior, they have shown themselves to be useless, they've shown themselves to be morally bankrupt, they've shown themselves to be incapable of moral action. But also we would note that cops have to de-escalate things, and we think simply by virtue of you having a felony on your record, it shows that you are incapable of de-escalating. Because if you were capable of de-escalating, you would have de-escalated such that you didn't commit a felony in the first place. But also we think it is simply evidence of violence in the past. And remember here, I think this might sound like I'm giving quite a biased idea of what these sorts of felonies are. But remember, this isn't just felonies in general. It is the felonies of people who would be accepted to police, to work as a police officer. And given that the people who choose who gets accepted as a police officer are not terribly moral people, you know? That, I think, is evidence of the fact that we are justified in using this characterization to say that these felonies are not particularly good. And it's important that we catch them before they join the force, because they might say, well, if they do bad things on the job, you know, we will hold them to account. I think, well, at that point, it's already too late. But we think it is once they are already in the force, they are already so well protected, simply because of the fact that if it's a policeman's word versus someone else's word, the cop is always the one who's trusted by the court. For instance, in a court of law, the standard of proof is far higher than otherwise. On this case, we think it's far harder to prove a second case than it is to simply point to a first case where they've been bad. But also, for instance, they're defended by things like police unions, where even in the case of someone who has obviously committed a crime, we think that they're still able to be defended by the power of these unions who can muscle around city councils and stuff like that. So this is the only way we can stop these people before they do something terrible. Before I go on, does closing government have a POI? Opening?
Yeah, cool. So it's unclear in your speech why you identified police that commit felonies, and in the same breath you also point to recidivism, when our model would not allow police that commit felonies to be employed again, and at the same time has a 3-year stand-down period, which likely tracks for recidivism. Can you engage with the model that opening government actually set up, and not your own characterization?
Right. Well, recidivism can happen more than 3 years later, right? Yeah, anyway, so I think just moving on to the rest of the case, it's also worth noting that even if this is all perfect, it just erodes trust in police, in the police, and just leads to antagonism. So even if these people are actually good, people just view the police as being common criminals like everyone else, so don't trust them in the first place. And you need people to trust police in order not to escalate violence against them and things like that. But also, once this happens, it is far harder to hold police to account. That is one, because people simply don't expect cops to be perfect anymore, because they see that it's normalized that cops can have committed felonies in the past. If a cop does something that's really bad, people won't be as outraged because that's just the expectation of what a cop does. Second of all, it launches the image of cops through feel-good stories. They're going to be like, oh, this drug dealer did something bad and then they became a cop. And then people think, oh, the cops are all right, we don't need to do as much. So what this means is you get things like less reporting, you get things like more violence. So in response to that stuff about how good cops now join the force, we think if they do join the force, they just immediately leave because so many people in the force are currently bad and we'll force them out if they're the ones who are seen as being siding with criminals for running their sort of street watch programs and stuff like that. But even if they stay, people on the street aren't going to listen to them because they're seen as betraying their lifestyle because they wear the badge. But also when they say, well, you can do useful things. So these people have things like knowledge about the way that drug shipments operate, etc., stuff like that. You can still just hire them in other capacities as informers, as consultants, etc. We get those same benefits. At the end of the day, we have to answer the question of who these cops are. The answer is obvious, and that's why opening opposition sweeps this debate.
Okay, I thank the Leader of Opposition. I now invite Deputy Prime Minister. Here. Hi, Deputy Prime Minister. Cool.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
I think it's important in the context of enormous police protests, we don't allow our judgment to become unnuanced. The protests don't happen because people hate police, but because they feel deeply betrayed. Even in minority communities, there's a consistent request that we have more police on the ground, more people who do their jobs effectively and keep them safe. And unfortunately, opening opposition stands for something that is inimical to the promise of the justice system. The idea that you are not irredeemable. You are a brother, you are a son, and we see you not just as the debt to society you incurred when you committed the crime, but as an enduring and positive connection. It follows that I'll explain three things. Firstly, I'll tell you why the police do this well, particularly in the comparative that was ignored by the opposition. Secondly, I'll just address head-on the idea that the prison industrial complex makes prisoners irredeemable people who should never have access to power. And then finally, I'll talk about the broader societal discourse that happens both about the role of the police and felons in society. Are police able to do this well? We brought you two mechanisms from Zach. Firstly, you're likely to have heavy scrutiny of the public, because as eloquently pointed out by opening opposition, people are wary of criminals and want to make sure that they're well taken care of. But secondly, there's also scrutiny from other cops who equally don't like crime and will be sure to make sure that people who aren't able to fit in are not able to do it. And I think, luckily, opening opposition gave this analysis to us. They explained how people who commit particularly heinous crimes, particularly unpopular crimes, are likely to be forced out. What they then focused on is a tiny minority of people, cops who, remember, have to be successfully prosecuted, something that they say is extremely unlikely under their side of the house. So it's a minuscule group that they have made their entire case around, but also they have to explain why the general hiring practice wouldn't already make excuses for these types of people. The group that we've talked about is the far more likely comparative, people who have spent 3 years out of prison, who've had kids, who've turned their lives around, and are able to gain access to these institutions. But note, even if we accept them at their exceedingly small community, what is the comparative? It's people like George Zimmerman who join community watches where they get no training, where they have access to almost all of the same protections they would otherwise have, when they avoid enormous amounts of public scrutiny, and there's no ability for the public to force them to engage in their will. Because note, if the opposition wants to believe that these police would hire those people, I don't understand why the police wouldn't share information with these community watch groups, why they wouldn't turn the same blind eye that they did with George Zimmerman, why they'd enforce the infractions that the community brings to them. These same protections apply to these people because the law enforcement unions equally stand up for community watch, and in segregated communities, these types of institutions operate as pseudo-police forces, which often have the same protections. Eden's going to have a lot of work to do to explain why their case still works with a group that doesn't get prosecuted in the first place, so isn't part of this debate, and secondly, has all the same protections that they would otherwise have, that is given the pseudo-police role of community watch. So we're winning the opening half at this stage. Now to take on the ludicrous assertion that the prison industrial complex, big words for bigotry, makes people irredeemable and never able to hold a job. Because the first thing to say is at the point where we hire these people, they're likely to be highly visible and they're likely to have a role within the community, as I'll be discussing later. But what they really wanted to assert is that no one can be well adjusted if they leave the police. And yes, police is awful for a lot of people, so I'm going to tell you exactly how most prisoners actually do reform. Yes, there is recidivism. We're unlikely to be hiring those types of people. We have ordinary hiring processes. We're likely to be taking the group of people who've stayed out of prison. Because note, the argument that was brought to you by the opposition was the same ordinary prejudice that ex-felons hear when the door slams in their face. Instead of an American accent, it's delivered in a city one. Recidivism doesn't just happen 3 years later because the vast majority of people age out of crime. They have kids, they get stable jobs, and just because they committed a felony when they were 19, like 70% of offenders in the United States commit the crime before the age of 23. Those people just age out of crime, right? This is a very well-established theory. You are likely to have kids, you are likely to get a job, you are likely to have some education, you're likely to be less around the types of community organizations, you're more likely to have things to do with your time. This means that if you've spent a couple of years behind bars, it is quite likely to get it right. And I agree that recidivism is bad, but once again falls out of this debate because it isn't dealt with, those people aren't hired, and they aren't likely to be part of the debate. The final push that they wanted to make is that they can't talk to victims, which maybe is fair, but police aren't stupid. They really want to avoid the public backlash that could come across if you have someone who's committed domestic violence counseling the victims. And if they don't, remember, the police officers that clearly exist under their side of the house already stack up these positions. But note, when you talk to offenders, you're likely to be highly effective. That's why all of the most effective crime reduction programs currently take ex-offenders, put them into the community, and ask them to turn out of crime. It's like the city of Chicago paying ex-gang members to try and be positive influences on their streets, and not those people are also chosen by the police. So while the opposition wants to run this bizarre mischaracterization of the way that most police officers commit their roles, we think that they are likely to pick people who are highly effective because their personal and professional reputations are on the line. And all of the material of Zach just stands up to you. As he explained, these people are more likely to understand the pressures. They're able to de-escalate because if you are in a gang, remember, let's just be clear about what happens to these people when they're on the street and in the community. They're likely in a highly tense environment that they could get shot in if they don't de-escalate. Criminals are quite good at de-escalating situations. They want to avoid turf wars. They want to avoid the types of anger and violence that can come from other criminals acting against them. They're far more trained in de-escalatory techniques, especially if they're people lower down the chain. Final thing I want to discuss in this debate, the use of power. I'll accept a POI from closing.
Okay, so wait, actually, no, I have nothing. Sorry.
Okay, sorry, I believe that's out of time. Why do we reduce power? First thing to say is weird balancing act taken by opening opposition, in that they think these people will just forgive the cops when they hire the police or when they hire criminals. No, in fact, the power that is disproportionately given to cops shouldn't be given to cops. And if people trust the police less on a reform basis, they're more likely to push for things like body cams. It's really easy to push for body cams when you're like, this person may have committed a crime in the past. We want to make sure we see what they're doing. We want to make sure we have adequate complaints process. In terms of trust, just once again, no, I'm quite disappointed. No analysis with the framing understanding that we got from Zach about the two groups. If you're on the streets, you're likely to trust these people more because they're more likely to understand and be empathetic to your experiences. Remember, we're taking a crop of people who can pass the tests of the police. They're likely to be well-functioning. But secondly, in terms of the general community, they're either already going to be wrapped up in the love of the police. I don't see why one rehabilitation program will suddenly change the dynamic they have with the police, but their opinion of criminals is likely to change a lot because we take a rehabilitation program that directly works and shows it to the people. At the end of this debate, we are very, very proud to stand for people who are redeemable, have redeemed themselves, and should have a role in helping their communities heal.
Okay, I thank the Deputy Prime Minister. May I now invite Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Get a thumbs up or something? Cool.
Okay.
Anyone who was redeemable would never apply to become a cop. They would never apply to be in a position of power where you abuse other people, where you mistreat them. And this is true and on a very statistical basis. The types of people who choose to become cops are also the types of people who choose to beat up their wives. They're the types of people who choose to accrue assault and battery charges. That is why in some cities in America, almost every cop on the force has a charge of domestic violence against them. So this is not about whether or not felons in general can be redeemed. It is about a statistical analysis, about the Venn diagram, about the type of felon who chooses to become a cop and the type of cop who is a good cop, right? And it's about the idea that the type of felon who also chooses to become a cop is an assaulter, is a drunk driving killer, is a domestic abuser, did do domestic violence and battery. These are things that can be, you know the other one that cops always do? They usually did illegal actions in the army where they raped someone in another country because they thought they would get away with it, which is the kind of truth that even if we don't win this debate, I would just like for you to understand the type of person that we would have to report to if this model was allowed to go ahead. So that is the first issue of characterization. Those are the most likely cops because they have the same aggressive tendencies that make someone want to be a cop. They are the most common crimes for men who have the exact same personality types of wanting power, of wanting to control, of being entitled to lord themselves over others the same way they lord themselves over women in the home. And for that reason, we would do anything to keep this type of bastard out of the force. And because importantly, drug dealers do not want to become cops. It's not like you're weighing up, should I become a drug dealer or should I become a cop? Because they usually do not have those paths in their community in the first place. And they certainly do not have those paths to having that kind of profession after becoming a felon when their community ties are likely to be cut off. Those types of people who are in drugs, who have drug charges or robbery charges when they are 17 or 18 are from hugely disadvantaged communities and where it is already incredibly difficult to become a cop. We would prefer for them to never become a cop, not because, as Auckland says, we think they're irredeemable, but because we think they would do more good in literally any other job. We would prefer for them to become literally any other thing, and we're willing to help them become literally any other thing on side opening opposition, but not a cop. Why? Firstly, we think that it will mean that they do awful things when on the force because recidivism rates are really high. What do they say? They say that only 67% of people do another crime, so we can just wait for them to do that crime and then hope the rest of them that are left over won't. But this means that the rest of them who haven't done a crime again have been rehabilitated. It means they haven't been caught or they haven't been in the right circumstance. For example, the exact circumstance where you have a job where your job is to exert power and violence over the community, but they are in no way well-adjusted people who would be good at the job description of being a cop. And importantly, in the force, they would be brutalized by the police who are taught to hate criminals because it is the only way they can justify their job of lording over a civilian population and treating them like shit. Lastly, because Auckland, and this is a really important mechanism, Auckland says they would put guns back in the hands of ex-felons. And cops shoot people when they claim they think that person has a gun. They shoot almost every black man they see because they think his wallet was a gun and they think he was a criminal. It is when you tell them that that is true, because this policy means you give guns back to criminals, that they are more likely to shoot more people because they have more reason to be scared that criminals have guns. And for that reason, the number of shootings of black people goes up as a result. Next, on trust, they say it would be good for us to have less trust because then people would take to the streets and do action, as if it was their complacency and love of the cops which is the reason why there was no reform. This is not true. Instead, it would increase the kinds of tensions with the cops, which make it that the cops choose to escalate violence and hurt people instead of de-escalating. Thirdly, on cartels already are too integrated with cops in a way that brutalizes the communities that they are in, taking this out of North America for a moment and into any other community, and interlinking those forces even more, such that when you come out of jail, you can work again in the police force, is a worse way of entrenching them. On gang members becoming cops, watch season 1 of The Wire. Like, if you're a gang member, you can't become a cop. You'll be shot by literally anyone. So that's why at the end of the speech, if you want more cops who are masculine, low energy, low empathy, too aggressive, love hurting other people, love brutalizing others, that would be a great way with the other team's policy. I'm now going to talk on a principal argument. The principal argument is this. So we hold cops in the law to a higher standard, which is that for example, if there's a punch up between two people normally, they are both held to the same standard of proof. But when a cop punches someone, there's a huge standard before that cop goes to jail. And when a person punches a cop, they basically go to jail double time. And the reason we give them that higher standard is because we believe that they have earned it in some sense. They are more likely to not ever break the law. That standard should not be given to cops. Finally, it is incredibly difficult to weed out the so-called bad apples in the force. And one way we know someone is a bad apple is because they are at home also brutalizing their wife. People who beat up their wife are far more likely to shoot back black people, for example, in the street, because they do not care about human life and they love killing others. So if we could at least kick them off the job for hurting their wife and giving her a black eye, even if we can't for killing the black person, that would be a good thing. Domestic abusers should not be cops. The fact that so many of them are is a disgrace. All cops are bastards, especially the ones that have already gotten in trouble for being bastards in the past. Fuck those guys.
Okay, I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition. May I now invite Member of Government. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
All right, cool. Hold on. Okay. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Opening government says that ex-convicts are good, sympathetic, etc., and therefore will gain the trust of communities. Opening opposition says that they're just absolutely terrible people. They will ravage the police force, will become super brutal. These are both massively assertive characterizations, and I don't think you should believe any of them from like face value, because people are different and people have different human natures. I think what closing government will do is enter and say, and explain why we are likely to reform the prison industrial complex in ways that are far more likely to ascertain that people who are ex-convicts will lead towards the path of good and are far more likely to pursue rehabilitative processes rather than ones that deter and are harsh on crime that are far more likely to cause the violent nature of prison systems, of gang abuse, etc. And I first want to take note that before I argue this, I know open government says that you want to be able to ensure perceptions, that if people believe they are good, that they can have responsibility, they will pursue reform. But I think, again, this depends on people believing they are good, when opening opposition just immediately believes that they are bad. So I don't think, or at best, I think that's a wash whether or not them being good or them being perceived as bad is likely to pursue a more rehabilitative or a more harsh prison system. I'd say uniquely this policy, however, forces the prison industrial complex such that if ever you hire any one of these individuals, if they are incredibly violent, if they are massively dangerous, and you put them and they go through the screening process of being a police, you have massively messed up your job. So I think what this forces is three things. A, that any abusive prison system are likely to create ex-felons who are very, very alienated from society, have predispositions towards violence, gangship, etc., like opening opposition says. What that means is police systems of punishment are far less likely to pursue these kinds of avenues of punishment precisely because if one of them becomes a cop, that is massively dangerous for the public relations of a precinct. That is massively dangerous for how you have trust between communities. And I think then trying to pursue methods of punishment that make people more violent, that don't regulate the violence that exists within prisons, ultimately means that you are likely to ensure that the police system becomes worse as a whole. Secondly, it means that the large responsibility that they can potentially offer requires a large amount of prerequisite integration. These are things like large amounts of prison education systems, large amounts of prison training that exists, large amounts of prison work integration that is starting to be pursued in many other countries. I would say you force that now because you want to ensure that the people who might become police in the future are competent in being able to take on their future work. And the reason for that is simple. Incompetence in systems means that higher rates of crime are likely to make you lose funding as a police force. It means that people who are incompetent cops will make squad leaders and precinct heads look like they're incompetent in being able to ensure that they can train their own policemen, look like they are bad leaders within their own squadrons. So all the incentives of the police system are far more likely to pursue rehabilitation towards reintegration because if any of them become cops and they are terrible cops, like opening opposition says, that is terrible for the police force. You will have more riots. You will have more massive backlash. And I think police force now are actively trying to run away against that. But lastly, I don't think opening half talks enough about the nature of work. The first thing I want to respond to is OO says, well, we support them getting literally any other job. The first thing I want to note is it's simply not that easy. The discrimination that exists against ex-convicts because people fear the trust that they might give them, they fear that they might steal stuff in their workplace, means that it's very difficult to ascertain work, and more often than not, it's only governments who are willing to hire a lot of ex-convicts. Why is that important? Rates of recidivism are not because people are evil. Rates of recidivism are because people do not feel like their life is able to productively contribute to the rest of society. People do not feel like they can ascertain their own basic needs and therefore need to steal or feel like other methods like drugs and other harmful activities are likely the only meaning they're going to be able to garner. So firstly, giving this job is uniquely available. Secondly, they might say, well, let's give them another job. I don't think for things like manual labor, for other kinds of work, that a lot of the skills here are easily as transferable versus someone who knows precisely what these communities look like, how to talk to someone who has been in contact with drugs before, how to be able to ensure that you can go into an incredibly high crime, dangerous community in ways that common police officers are probably uninformed in being able to do and are more likely to be brutal in these kinds of methods then. What does this prove? You can believe ex-convicts can be good. You can believe ex-convicts can be bad. But the system starts to reform individuals in ways that ascertain their goodness because evilness, incompetence, and non-integration are risks to the trust and the capacity for the police system to function and therefore ensure that we get the positive characterization of closing government, not one that is merely assertive because they are somewhat sympathetic to people who are victims of crime before. Before I move on, I'll take closing opposition.
Okay, so this is literally just a knife, because if you listen to OG's model, you don't get rehabilitation since people definitionally need to be rehabilitated over a 3-year period that they provide.
So the first thing I want to point out is that doesn't ascertain what the quality of these rehabilitative processes are likely to look like, but secondly, as to what gravity this is likely to be. Because OG can't run that and say there's already a context of a prison industrial system. So at best, I guess that's engaging with OO's context of being able to reform that. But at best, I would also say that it improves current systems that are currently flawed and unable to be able to ascertain the quality of people who go through this rehabilitative process. Secondly, on brutality. And honestly, it's a bit of a disgusting characterization coming from OO that all criminals are just dangerous people. We should never trust them. They're going to beat their wives, etc. I would say the difference between a criminal and a cop is that a criminal does things out of circumstance, while a cop might, cops now at least, are ones who actively engage in this kinds of dangerous behavior if that's what they want to be able to go at. Why does brutality happen? It's not just that people are unsympathetic. A lot of the time, and this is the sympathy that white people always say with respect to cops, that you feel a sense of fear, that you feel hostility, that you're afraid that some black individual might pull out a gun and shoot you, and then you have to preemptively strike first. I think it is uniquely these individuals who know precisely what this environment is like, when to fear, are not always put in this hostile situation where there is a predisposition towards distrust that I think then ensures they are unlikely to take rash and immediate actions that are likely to be able to pursue violence and brutality first. That I think you only do when you are someone from that environment, when you have grown up in the ghetto and are not likely to pull out the gun immediately and know how to talk to someone, know what the likely reaction is, and not just assume that everyone holding a gun is holding a gun. And there are many more specific ways to connect that I don't think OG does. Number one, you often have assigned police partners and police squads. That means that even if it's 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people who are ex-felons, they often have the capacity to regulate the people who are assigned with them. Number two, it is the increased voting power with respect to police unions, the ability to change training process that ensure that you are more likely to pursue humane ways of de-escalation that I think are necessary in being able to ascertain these situations. Number three, I just think that people in these kinds of communities are more likely to ascertain that they are unlikely to be abused and therefore engage more cooperative things like being able to serve as a witness, being able to provide evidence that now the no snitching, you don't trust the cops, 5-0 are coming, that I think the culture that I think is currently unable to cooperate with these kinds of communities, I'm very proud to propose.
Okay, I think the member of government might now invite member of opposition. Here.
So in our extension, we're going to try to deal with the best case scenario that we get from side government, where every criminal that's being hired is fully rehabilitated, but still has the same probability of committing crime as any normal human being would. And we put them in a position where they're not even interacting with the victims of their past crimes. So say we'll put rapists on white collar crimes and prove why even then we're likely still winning on just optics and perception that we're going to explain are unique on back half. But before I do that, I want to do some refutation to what we hear out of opposing government that I think is incredibly problematic. So firstly, they assert that because there's this minor fear that maybe one day the criminal I'm sentencing now might eventually become a cop. And let's think about what the probability of this is from the get-go. Maybe there's a 0.1% chance this person becomes a cop. I, as a judge who historically has sentenced people to ridiculously punitive measures that had no rehabilitative power, I'm suddenly completely changed by this new revelation, and now have an entirely new model of criminal justice system with which I could punish people, which firstly doesn't even exist in the first place. So it's unclear how anyone's perception would suddenly create that out of nowhere. Secondly, unlikely to be true given the public's historical perception. I think this is incredibly unlikely. And thirdly, it's unclear why this would be the tipping point for anyone, since feasibly there are already tons of incentives for humans to care about reducing recidivism, because you can commit violent crimes again regardless of whether or not you're a cop. So there should be probably very strong underlying incentives to do this anyways. The fact that it hasn't is probably a testament to how unlikely CG's impacts are. The second thing they say is that you get somehow rehabilitation for being a cop. And firstly, I just don't think police often police agencies are government institutions that should serve the role of rehabilitating people by giving them a badge and gun. But moreover, I just think, firstly, I think the stuff we said about this being a knife to OG is probably true. To the extent that they try to convince you that this argument has impact, they're necessarily discrediting their opening half, to the extent that opening half relies very heavily on these people already being reformed. And given the fact that O was very clearly beating CG and OG, if these people are violent criminals again, it's probably unlikely we should care about rehabilitation. But also just think about the comparative options you have available. If you think that it's so important to get these people jobs, you can probably get better jobs. Onto our constructive materials. Sorry, I'll take a POI after. Yeah. So I think that one thing is clear, that the optics of this program are almost always going to be incredibly negative as people view policing and criminals for a few reasons. Firstly, because sensationalism is incredibly profitable for news media organizations that can get tons of like invested, emotionally connected views by talking about like violent crimes committed by like, police that were hired as ex-felons. And it's also an incredibly useful way for doing like targeted political advertising. If I'm running for sheriff in a community that has just adopted a bunch of like the ex-felons as criminals, and I think this is a palatable thing that might turn off a ton of voters, it is incredibly useful to cherry pick small numbers of examples of this policy going wrong, which it inevitably will, because all people make mistakes at some point in their life. And if I want to look in a big country and find one example of this going wrong, I can, and blow that up disproportionately in a way that might frame me as a good person, that I can get into office and undo this policy, or that I can, I don't know, do news coverage about it, get people super angry and make tons of money off of it, right? There are comparatively substantially less incentives to talk about how good this policy is, in the sense that being like, oh, look at this person that is just like a normal cop now is not a particularly interesting news story, and doesn't give you a lot of like political saliency if you're running for office, right? But the fact that this is a convenient narrative means that perception gets worse. I would note one thing. Even if cops are like violent criminals now, as opening opposition characterizes, this is still generally not public perception for the vast majority of people, because the media generally loves simping for our boys in blue, right? Like, I think that the fact that you can now target criticism, especially from more moderate or like right-wing leaning sources, towards this like newly created wave of police officers that are ex-felons, gives you a way of like sort of half agreeing with like the bad things police do, without actually like targeting individual like police officers that hold that you see are part of like your people. So you could target this policy as being the reason for all of the failings within policing, without actually acknowledging any serious problems. So we get a unique negative narrative where it previously did not exist, right? So why is this bad? So firstly, public access to safety in policing. We'd say that police rely on public cooperation in the form of reporting, testifying, and calling the police, all of which are sensitive to perception, i.e. there are some people that are like, will call 911 for anything, like a black person sitting in Starbucks, and there are some people that won't call like 911 for literally anything because of their negative perception of the police. And human beings exist on a gradient here, where there's a large impact on their willingness to cooperate and get help based on their public perception of the police. I think that the impact that people have when you're calling someone into your house that might be a rapist or murderer, which is a narrative that political opportunists and news media benefit from shoving down your throat at every opportunity, means that tons of people that need help will not get it. Consider the number of people that are abused by a partner, for example, and never get help, and consider how many more of those people will turn away from systems that might be capable of keeping them safe when they think that the person that's coming to their aid, if they do a report, was someone that is an domestic abuser, right? Note that the key here is that even if it's true that cops already fit this status quo, which probably undercuts a lot of opening opposition's like underlying argumentation, because if cops are already criminals, the underlying criminality is unlikely to change anything. The perception of criminality that we get on our side that is uniquely inflated, because in the counterfactual, people probably do have generally perceptions of like positive perceptions of police, means that we get substantial harms as people are now unwilling to get help from the police when they otherwise would have, which is probably horrible for individual people. Secondly, on public perception of criminals, but before that, opening government.
Your case seems entirely uncomparative when the media stories that are run aren't gang members become police, but gang members kill the police officers. Why isn't this at least a better narrative than that, and shows that there is a pathwards towards these people being redeemable?
Congratulations. We go from gang members kill the police to gang members kill individual members of people within the police. Like, that's not a comparatively better narrative. But I think that talking about gang members being bad is probably a less interesting narrative, less politically insightful narrative than saying that like there's this easily actionable policy of us hiring ex-felons that we can change, that I, as someone running for political office, can take advantage of, which means you're probably going to get a hyperinflation of this policy on your side of the house. So public perception of criminals. When over a large country, every example is cherry-picked and blown up, I don't think you get any sort of positive perception. Rather, I think you see tons of criminals reoffending because that's what is politically opportune to show. And you don't get desired rehab, but you see, okay, we need to keep ourselves safe somehow. So you massively extend sentences, because one way to stop someone from being a police officer is to never let them out of prison, which means criminals probably face worse sentences. And people doing hiring look to these examples, see people not being rehabilitated, and don't hire felons in their own private practices, which probably leads to worse hiring practices for these people. We'd also say, in terms of being a good way to connect to your community, gangs and criminals are probably viewed as horrible within minority communities and are generally seen incredibly negatively. The notion that this is a legitimate form of representation is super fucked. We should probably just hire actual minorities that aren't violent criminals that can understand their communities without getting all of the negative backlash from having gang members patrol those communities in the first place. Very proud to oppose.
Okay, I think the member of opposition might now invite government whip. Here.
Hello, can I be seen and heard? Oh, wait.
Yes. Okay.
Whatever. Okay, I'm gonna start. Three, two, one. Two issues in this debate. Let's start with the first. Are these felons going to be rehabilitated, or on which side are they better rehabilitated? Opening government said they're already rehabilitated, we can just wait the 3 years. Opening opposition clashed with this. They said they're all evil because of high recidivism rates, because they're all already bad because they all committed crime in the past. Adding analysis isn't a knife, and that's what we did in this debate. Rather than just sticking out our guns and engaging the deadlock that exists in the opening half, we break that deadlock by providing analysis. Why is it that this motion particularly causes the change that makes them rehabilitate, which makes them not do the crimes, which makes the justice system not as bad? So that's the analysis we gave in this debate, and I'm going to be showing to you how this engages with all the analysis we heard from the previous speaker. So the first thing we heard is these people are already bad. Because of this high recidivism rates, these people are bad people. You have to recognize these recidivism rates don't exist in a vacuum. Firstly, they exist because of post-prison discrimination. Because they're unable to get a job, a lot of these people are forced to go back into crime, are forced to steal again because they're unable to get a job, because they're unable to integrate into society, because they face mass discrimination outside of society, right? But what happens when this system exists is you reduce the stigma that exists outside of prison. You reduce their ability to not be able to get jobs and their ability not to be able to integrate into the system. Firstly, this happens directly, right? Because the fact that they can get a job in the police force means that there's on net more jobs for these people to be able to get outside of prison, which means on net they're less desperate, on net they're less likely to do crime and do recidivism. But on the second level of analysis, we told you because allowing them to take the policeman jobs actually reduces the stigma against them, right? Because you can see that these people are trusted by society. These people can handle responsibility. These people aren't just violent individuals, right? What this means is it's less likely that these people are forced to go back into crime, are forced to recidivize, and forced to do those bad actions again. So even if recidivism rates are high right now, they won't be the point at which you pass this motion because of the levels of analysis we gave, rather than the assertions of our opening that once you wait 3 years, it's completely fine. What else did they say? There's higher, you have to recognize, there's also higher recidivism rates because of racist cops that hang over minorities, hang over ex-criminals. They exaggerate what these people do. They constantly trip them up and make sure that they are caught doing crimes, caught speeding, or caught having things on the record. This is widely documented in the Western world, in the United States, and all these things. We change this recidivism, right? Because on our side, the police system is so much less likely to be like that. They're so much less likely to be against people from the ghetto, against certain minorities and all these things, to the point at which you have felons from these ghettos communities, from these certain minorities that are now working within the police system, right? So by allowing them to join the police system, firstly, you reduce the stigma that occurs against these certain groups. You reduce the incentive to constantly trip them up, to constantly increase the records and constantly put them back in jail and all these things, right? What this all shows is that even if there's high recidivism, the point at which this motion exists, there won't be high recidivism anymore. It's highly likely we get better rehabilitation because the systems change, because specifically of this motion, rather than assertions of our opening. What is the next thing we heard from the previous speaker, right? He said the judges won't change the system. It's highly unlikely the prison systems are actually going to change. Why is this not true? I think firstly, it's not just about the judges, right? It's about the political will that the people have that actually changes the policies around the justice system, that changes the maximum sentences, that changes the way that judges actually prosecute people and put these people in jail, and the amount of protections that prisoners have against judge discrimination and all these things. We think even if on net judges don't change, the political will change. And this is where our argument was so important. Because the opening opposition said, prisons are bad and they're abusive. We think, yes, they might be bad, but it's specifically because they're bad right now that when we enact this policy, they're going to have to change. Because those people that be subject to abuse could become policemen, could abuse civilians in the future could do lots of bad actions. What this means is there's significant incentives to now change the prison system to make sure that they're more rehabilitatory like they are in Europe, like they are in the UK and a lot of other countries, right? What does this look like? This looks like increasing education for people within the prison system. This looks like less abusive practices that exist within the prison system. And there's significantly more political will pushing for these things to actually happen, the point at which these people will actually integrate into society rather than on their side where you can just ignore these people moving forward because you know that they're probably not going to get a good job, they're probably going to have no power over you, and they're probably not going to be really integrated in the system moving forward anyway. The systems that exist right now push them, the prison system, to be abusive. We change that system to the point at which these people can have power over you in the future. More than all of this, we tell you, we change the system for the cops, right? Because if you know that the cops, you trust the cops less because they might be criminals, because they might be felons, then it's less likely you have immunity for cops. It's less likely you allow the cops to be abusive and do lots of bad actions. It's more likely you push regulations against them, right? So this directly clashes with the argument that came from opening opposition, that once they become cops, they're immune. Once they become cops, you can't handle them or you can't do anything against them, even if they are abusive. We change all of that by having felons in the police force, and we change it for all cops moving forward. So what this all shows is it's highly likely that these people will be rehabilitatory because of this motion rather than just an assertion based on our opening. Second issue, where will the police force be better off? What did we hear from opening? They said the police are brutal and they're bad to people from minorities and ghettos. Meaning, firstly, it's highly unlikely those are the people you're going to rehire. If they were already a cop before and they already did abusive practices before, why would you hire that same person to become a cop again? It's highly unlikely you're going to be, that makes no sense. They just asserted this from opening, right? It's highly likely you're going to hire people that committed other felonies that are unrelated to being a policeman, that are unrelated to all of these things. But more than all of this, we told you specifically from a previous speaker in a substantive point why it's so much better on our side. Firstly, these cops aren't going to be racist, right? Because these people are from those minorities. Secondly, these cops are going to likely be from the ghettos, from these poor communities. So there's less stigma against these ghettos, there's less stigma against these poor communities. Thirdly, they were on the receiving end of brutality and they know people that were on the receiving end of brutality. It's highly unlikely that these new felon cops are going to be as bad as the cops right now. It's highly unlikely these new felon cops are going to be as brutal as the cops right now because of structural reasons. And unlike our opening, we give you mechanisms as how they're going to change this. Firstly, they have partners, which means that they can change the actions of their partners directly by saying, hey, you should stop being brutal, you should stop doing these actions. Secondly, the fact that they can join now police unions means that they can vote in police unions, means that they can change the policies that cops actually do and the bad actions that cops do. Thirdly, they can change the trainings and all these things. This all shows, rather than our opening, which is asserted it, mechanistically, how they actually change the police system and how they actually make these things a lot better. What else did the opening wrong? They said it's highly unlikely they're gonna empathize with people committing felonies, so they're not actually gonna put the abusers in jail and do all these bad things. Firstly, using your own analysis opening, there's no marginal difference. Because if you say all policemen are bad, then why does adding felony people, us bad individuals, make any marginal difference? On your side, these people would empathize with the felonies either way. So your logic doesn't make any sense. Secondly, it's highly likely they're going to be empathetic towards the people, even if they did that particular felony in the past, right? Because they went through the justice system already. They heard the testimony of the other side. They heard how much their actions and their abuse harmed the other individual. And they're put to jail for that, and they're forced to reflect on it for years. It's highly likely they're going to empathize now with the other side. But thirdly, and more importantly, it's highly likely you're actually going to empathize with criminals now, right? Because on your side, you have to recognize that these people, that the criminals, have no empathy for them, which means that you brutalize them, which means that you harm them. That changes the point at which you actually have these people who did felonies now doing these actions. And the point at which they empathize with them more, it's more or less likely you're going to be brutal. It's much more likely you're going to be more fair to these criminals and you're going to hold them accountable properly. This all shows that we get better police individuals and we get a better system for them for better rehabilitation. Rather than opening it, asserted that we proved it mechanistically. We take this debate. Thank you.
Okay, I think the government whip might now invite opposition whip. Here.
So the case we give you on CO was rather simple, which is that in a world where you allow ex-felons to be a part of the policing force, you give the entire policing force a person to place blame on when anything goes wrong. You give the news agencies the ability to cover exclusively stories of ex-felons doing bad, and politicians to use this narrative in order to blame all problems that are maybe already coexisting, but to push that blame onto the people who are ex-felons and get away with the underlying problems that exist under the status quo. But secondly, we told you how uniquely the perception of police, who I think GovVeg this round, believes that police sometimes can be good, which is why their underlying framing from both OG and CG is that they want some type of reform. We proved to you on CO why the perception is going to get exponentially worse, to the point in which people no longer have trust in the police, to the point in which, as Jacob impacts you, that people are no longer going to call into the police when they need them the most, that people are no longer going to testify and give evidence that is necessary in terms of having success in court. All of these impacts went unresponded to by CG and are going to be winning us around. I'm going to mainly talk about first some framing and then refutation to the two Gov teams, lastly weighing over our opening. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is that I think Jacob and I are able to simply override the entire opening clash that happens on if cops are good or bad, because we proved to you that even in a world in which some of these ex-felons might be good and might be bad, we'd say that uniquely the optics of who they are becomes exponentially worse. Why is that the case? I think we said a few things. The first is the response we get from CG here is maybe the news will cover the cases in which ex-felons are good. But here's the problem with that. No, as Jacob points to you, our mechanism was on sensationalism, and no news agency is going to be an ex-felon today gave someone a ticket and they didn't shoot the person. That's not the type of story that gets covered. Rather, they're going to cherry pick out, as we talked to you about in extension, the cases in which an ex-felon decides to ticket someone and also uses aggressive violence, because those are the stories that make money. Those are the stories that get covered again and again, and those are the stories that are politically palatable to a left-wing politician who can now use those cherry-picked examples to try and say, here's why we need to roll back this policy that that GovBench has tried to put into existence, right? So we'd say for those reasons, that's why the optics are going to be bad, because news stories are able to uniquely use this. The second thing is you now as a police agency are able to classify quote-unquote good cops and quote-unquote ex-felon cops, right? And this classification is harmful, right? Because that's when you enable them to place blame solely on the new felons who are now joining the police force and rid the people that pre-existed. How then does this refute most of OG? Okay, so OG I think says two things. First, they talk to you about reform. The problem with their case is they never actually prove to you why it is that their mechanisms for why you get reform are you are now going to you're going to do increased background checks because you know that when you don't want to hire people that are going to make your institution look bad, right? A very similar case that we kind of get out of CG later on, in terms of why you get increased screening and why you get reform within the institution. Two reasons why this fails. First of all, I'd say that externally, you don't really have any incentives to do reform in this way. Why? Because as the same framework that OG brings out, a lot of the types of felons who are convicted status quo are convicted unjustly, which is why a lot of people who are more left-wing, who are the people that you need to advocate for the reforms that OG talks about, are never going to advocate for those reform status quo, because people who are on the left who would get that don't want to have background checks because they don't want to doubly hurt a lot of people with a criminal record, right? Because they know that because OG flags this, right? That there's a lot of people who are unfairly convicted just because they have a lower socioeconomic background. That is the reason why a lot of people don't want to have the reform via the metric that OG says of background checks. This is why OG is not able to render enough political capital to actually get reform as they say they do, which is why externally we'd say they don't actually have the incentive to get increased background checks and get that type of reform. Secondarily, I tell you that internally, inside the police institution, you also don't have incentives for reform. That's because exactly what I told you about, that adding ex-felons is actually really good for you as a policing institution, because now you could, when things go wrong, you can push the blame on them because you can cover the stories of the times when ex-felons fucked up, as opposed to the times when other people within your institution messed up. This is why internally within policing unions, you have no metric for reform. So at the end of this class, OG has no external pressure to get reform, nor internal pressure to get reform. So reform vastly fails on their side. I think that on reform, closing government here says that you're going to use less harsh punishment because one day these people might become cops. I think that Jacob already told you this is extremely unlikely. I have a few more responses to this. The first thing I'd say is that in a world where they might become cops, one of your responses equally could be to just give them higher sentences, because it means that they're going to be out of working in jobs at other points in their life, and that is typically a response to increased freedom of criminals, right? You give people more freedom, and then the response is we should have higher sentences so that they can't come out and work again. But the other response I'd say is this is generally ridiculous because the CG is reliant on having some types of backlash that pressure police institutions to change because they don't want negative public perception. But if recidivism rates are already really high status quo, it means that backlash backlash is already bad because you already have cops who are like, you already have ex-felons who do things like go and be a teacher in the future or work anywhere literally in society, which you can point to have failure. So if they met for backlash because the police institution fucked up and the prison system was unsuccessful is the reason why CG is going to get any change, they would have already seen that status quo and they didn't prove a meaningful tipping point as to why they actually get any meaningful form of reform. Okay, the last thing we hear from opening government is this idea that it's good to put people who have empathy into the police union, and the way that OG thinks that you get like justice for minority groups is to put felons into the police union. But like, this is genuinely ridiculous, right? Because as we already respond to this, we'd say there are a bunch of better ways to do this, right? You take people who are in high crime communities, who are marginalized people that weren't already pushed to the edge of convicting a crime, people that have better like ways of de-escalating, and people who you can't point to as like a default metric to harm the optics of the policing union. You take people with like marginalized backgrounds and you put those people into the policing force, right? Like if the police force cared like fuck all about having empathetic people, they could already do that. We'd say it's better then to take people who are like just live in high crime communities, people who can be sympathetic, and put them in as opposed to putting the ex-felons. That's so we can get better forms of representation. Okay, on weighing our case over our opening half, I think like a few things that I want to say. The first is that like even if opening op says that you are a bad cop already, they undercut their own impacts because they firstly like frame cops already status quo as being bad, which means it's unclear that they prove a tipping point for adding these new bad cops. The second thing is they don't characterize any delta as to why it is in their world, in a world where OO already frames that cops are seen as bad, why adding ex-felons are bad. What Jacob and I uniquely bring you here is that we say adding more criminals is a way in which you can point to the policing force as being like extra bad, right? We're able to just claim extra impacts to the point in which you say felons are now added. Our impacts here were multiple, but primarily that people no longer call in when they need help. They don't use the policing force that is there to help them. You waste billions of like, taxpayer dollars on a system that is completely broken and you never want to fix it. I'm proud to stand on CO.
Okay, I thank Opposition Whip and I thank everyone for the great debate. The judges will be moved to their different breakout rooms, so just please stay put. Thank you.
Thank you.